afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Michael Corin, and I am the Chief Medical Officer and a Senior Investigator here at Jacksonville Center for Clinical Research. I'm also a past president of the Academy of Physicians in Clinical Research.
Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm Dr.
It's
James.
good morning somewhere around there.
Yeah. I'm Dr. James Powell. I am Chief Medical Officer for Norix Incorporated. I am a retired Senior Medical Director for Procter & Gamble Pharmaceuticals and Principal Investigator for Project Impact, which is increased minority participation and awareness of clinical trials.
Thank you for coming, James. James came in from Cincinnati, and it's a delight to be working with him. Thank you, really. Thank you for coming. So we're going to talk today about protecting patients' rights during clinical research, and particularly the role of informed consent. And this is a key underpinning of our ethical ability to do research on human beings. It's a huge responsibility, and I'm just humbled every day to think that I have the privilege of being able to do this. And we can do this because there are very strong protections in place for subjects and rules of informed consent and engagement with the patients. So we're going to talk about that. And when we talk about that, we get into ethical principles. And this is really one of my favorite sayings. I use it all the time. Martin Luther King saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think that's absolutely beautiful. It's picturesque. It has great imagery. And I think these inspirational words apply to clinical research. But I would argue that the pathway from injustice to justice is not a smooth MLK arch, but it's actually this jagged line with points of inflection. And eventually we got to justice. I think we're in an era where people participate in clinical trials and feel they're being part of something that is just. But getting there was a bit of a process.
Yes, absolutely. And part of that jagged that line is that there have been quite a bit of issues over the course of time with respect to loss of life and things that have led us to the place where we are now, where we think we understand a little bit better. We're not perfect yet as to how to manage clinical research. We have not been able to get anywhere, get any gain without some level of pain to the population. And I think, unfortunately, that's the way it's been, and I think that's where it continues, even modern day with
yeah, that's a great point. I guess there's no gain without pain.
No gain without pain.
So the other thing that I've learned over the years is that the perspective of physicians like ourselves versus the patients is completely different. So we had an interesting scenario several years ago. We had a patient here in the center in our phase 1 unit who happened to be a cartoonist. And while he was here, he came up with this cartoon which said, "Okay, Bill, you get your clothes back as soon as you agree to participate in the study." So when you think about that, it just serves to show you the imbalance of power between the medical community and the patients we're trying to attract.
Well, one of the things I always talk about, this is how you determine who has the power in the relationship, the one that has clothes on. Okay?
And you can see we have that panel to cover the private parts so that we can maintain a PG-13 rating.
And I'm sure you don't do work with informed consent with naked patients, right?
I'll take the fifth on that. All right. So we're going to start with an audience participation question. So this is called the MedEvidence series, and it's a program to convey medical information. But I want to see if you guys know anything about it, knowing that you've never seen this slide before. So let's do a multiple choice question. So what is MedEvidence? Is it an educational program led by physician scientists to explore medical trends and breakthroughs? Is it a hybrid learning experience, both in-person live and virtual? Is it a triumph of the Socratic teaching method, which combines modern learning with some of the traditional methods of learning, the best of the old and the new? Is it an exploration of real data with experts? Or is it all the above? So what do you think? What do you think?
All of the above.
Everybody say all the above?
Yes.
Okay, everybody's nodding their head. Would you say everybody's nodding their head? Okay. And the answer is all of the above. Isn't that amazing? So you're all educated people, and just by taking tests, the SATs and all these things over the years, and by seeing things in context, you were able to get the right answer without knowing anything about the topic, all based in context. So it's interesting how the human mind works. So we're going to have a series of these questions, and I can guarantee you that not all the answers will be all the above. All right, so here we go. Let's talk a little bit about the Socratic teaching method. So the Socratic teaching method goes back to ancient Greek days, Socrates. It's a form of cooperative, argumentative dialogue between individuals. You notice it's cooperative, argumentative. Just because you're having an argument with somebody doesn't mean you can't cooperate. That's probably lost in this, in the modern days of the media. But actually, that's the way people used to get to consensus, is by saying, hey, I think this. No, I think that. I think this. I think that. Okay, why do you think this? And that brings out different elements of the way you're thinking about a problem. So it's to stimulate critical thinking and draw out ideas and the underlying presuppositions that influence people. So this is what we want to bring back to medical education. And we want to use this modality to make those points.
Dr. Korn, what's the difference between a supposition and a presupposition?
James, there's a wise guy in every crowd. I'll have two answers for you, sir. The first is that the presupposition is that little thought that happens right before you have a supposition. But the real answer to the question is that a presupposition and a supposition are the same thing, just like flammable and inflammable are the same thing. So, but thank you for the question. There are no bad questions here. Well, usually not. Anyway, so which of the following constitute subject protections in clinical research? Why don't you take this over, James?
All right. So, which of the following? First one. Study IRB reviewing the protocol, informed consent form, data safety monitoring board, or involved clinical investigator, or all of the above. What do you think? All the above. We said they weren't going to be all of the above.
Okay, who thinks it's not all of the above? Anybody? All right, let's see what the answer is.
Okay,
Oh, you guys are smart. Good. We're going to have to make these tougher questions. We got a smart audience here.
Okay, so what should the clinical investigator know? They need to study of medical ethics and clinical research has a long history dating back to antiquity. During this history, measures have evolved to shield patients from harm during clinical research. And understanding the history of these measures strengthen the clinical investigators' effectiveness, including the ability to communicate modern subject protections. If you don't understand the issues and the ethics, then you're going to have a hard time expressing them and sharing them with your patient population, what their protections are in the process.
So I guess I'll jump in. I'm kind of like
Okay.
I'm the history buff around
Yeah,
here.
you're the history. You
Or
experienced
at
it,
least,
so you can
my
talk
kids tell me
about
I live in the past.
it.
Well, anyhow, so it's interesting. So if you go back to antiquity, as you mentioned, James, is that there were the general feeling that the elite people of society, the educated, learned people of society, were able to learn things from the unsophisticated people in society. That was the general concept. And the idea of sacrificing a few criminals for the betterment of society was completely reasonable. That was the feeling back in the Greek days. And the actual author who was the first one to articulate this concept was a fellow named Celsus, who was born and lived around the time of Christ. And the interesting thing about him is that he wasn't a physician or a surgeon. He was basically a writer. He was just one of these learned intellectual patricians, and he wrote an encyclopedia. And it was part of an oral tradition. And he was the first one that came up with the concepts of what medical ethics should look like based on the fact that we have the learned people of the world and then the unfortunates. And when the printing presses came around in the late 14th century, this got published. And his book was called De Medicina. And it's considered a landmark document. And the manuscript sets the ethical tone and the standard for ethics in medicine by this statement: as many imagine, it is not cruel to sacrifice a few criminals to seek cures for the blameless people of the time.
And of course, my issue with this is who determines who's the criminal?
Right. Yeah. right. Who's the criminal? And if they're prisoners, one person's prisoners is another person's hero.
Exactly.
So, I guess we'll get into an audience participation question. So, which of the following does not represent a government patient protection landmark? Which of the following does not represent a government patient protection landmark? Is it 1, the Pure Food and Drug Act, 2, the Belmont Report, 3, the XYZ affair, 4, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, or 5, the National Research Act. So the difficulty of the questions got a little bit harder. So, who wants to be brave and volunteer for this? Okay.
Number 4.
Number 4, which does not represent a government patient protection landmark. Anybody else want to make a guess?
I'm going to say, never mind.
You sure?
I'm sure.
Okay. Who else? Anybody else want to take a guess here?
Take a chance.
How about this guy? He's wearing 2 masks. Have you been vaccinated?
Yes.
Okay. Never be too cautious. Everybody here has been vaccinated, by the way. Well, that's why we're not wearing masks and we're talking to each other. Go ahead.
I'll go with number 3, the XYZ affair.
Okay. Are you familiar with the alphabet?
Okay.
All right. Any other thoughts? So let's have a show of hands. Who thinks it's number 1? Anybody? Who thinks it's number 2? Who thinks it's number 3? Who thinks it's number 4? And who thinks it's number 5?
You raise your hand twice.
The answer is number 3, the XYZ affair. Does anybody know what the XYZ affair is? Okay, we'll get to that later. Yeah, so getting back to the history of clinical trials, there's some really, really important milestones that are related to this concept of protecting patients' rights. And one of the things that's interesting is that this has been a worldwide process, and what's happened in the US is a little bit different than what's happened in other parts of the world. So one of the really important pivot points for clinical trials happened actually during the smallpox pandemic of 1721. And back around that time, there was a big debate about whether or not the concept of inoculations made any sense. So just to remind everybody, smallpox was absolutely devastating back in those times. It would hit a community, and 20 or 30% of the people in the community would die from this infection. It was horrible. But what people found is that if you were survivors of one epidemic, chances are you would get through the next one without any problems. So people, really folk medicine, largely it was in Turkey for the Europeans, were taking the pus from somebody with smallpox and putting it into a little needle and injecting it into somebody else. In fact, they went further than that. They had surgeons that would literally cut wounds into people and put the pus from somebody that had smallpox into a healthy person. And that was inoculation. So some people thought it was barbaric, and other people saying, well, it seems to work. So it was a big debate. So this was the concept, literally taking pus from lesions and giving it to somebody else. You can imagine that was controversial. So back in 1721, there was a horrible pandemic, and parts of the royal family were having their family members affected by this, and they were scared to death. So somebody came up with the idea, well, let's test this concept of inoculations on prisoners, because that's what we do. When we try and learn something, we get prisoners. So they went to the worst prison in London called the Newgate prison, and they found some people that would be willing to volunteer for smallpox inoculations in exchange for getting out of jail. A lot of these people were actually on death row, the equivalent. They were sentenced to die. And this is widely considered the first clinical trial as a planned experiment. So this was all planned out, and because of that, this is a clinical trial. And having a trial, having a medical question that's answered with structured research is a breakthrough. And it's also protection. So actually, when I first started my career, I don't know if it's true for you, you had some doctors that kind of said, I don't know if this drug works, but I'll try it on my next 10 patients. Did you see that?
Yeah, I heard it. In fact, patients have talked to me about that. When a doc says that, then that confuses them with respect to research versus practice. That often happens in the community.
Yeah, and that's unethical. So if you ever see a doctor that says, I'm going to try this on my next 10 patients to see if it works, find another doctor. But the fact that they did a structured experiment is really, really important. It's a breakthrough. So a couple of tidbits. One is that there was written consent for this trial, but it's from the king. So the investigators went to the king and got consent. And they also got the order to commute the sentences of the people who participated. All 6 inoculated subjects remained free of smallpox during the follow-up when they were out in the community during this horrible smallpox pandemic, including one subject who was paid to sleep with smallpox victims. So she actually slept in the same bed as people with smallpox and never got smallpox because she had been inoculated. One of the volunteers did not disclose he had smallpox previously, the first known protocol violation. And interesting, 3 of the 6 freed prisoners committed additional crimes that led to repeat incarceration. So recidivism was a problem back then as well. Now, during the same year, this also was an issue that confronted the U.S., but the U.S. approach was a little bit different. So on April 22nd, 1721, a British ship came into Boston Harbor, and it was a sailor who developed symptoms of smallpox during the trip. He was isolated, and when he got to port, he was isolated, but despite his isolation, smallpox spread rapidly through the Boston colony. And Onesimus, who was a slave given to the Puritan leader Cotton Mather, told Cotton Mather, hey, you know what, I got inoculated when I was in Africa, and this stuff works, you got to try it. So Cotton Mather said, okay, well, that kind of makes sense, and he went out and started advocating it. So Cotton Mather and a guy named Boylston went out, and again, the American way is you just kind of go out and you do it. It's entrepreneurial. You don't need a king to sign off on it. You just go out and do it. And they found 287 people in the Boston colony in 1721, and they inoculated them. And what they did is then they followed the outcomes to see what happened to the 287 versus everybody else in Boston. And what was absolutely remarkable is that the fatality rate in Boston from smallpox for people who are not inoculated was 15%. But for the people who were inoculated, it was only 2%, which would be statistically significant in any evaluation. So isn't that cool? And this is cross-cultural cooperation. And also showing the difference between the American style and the British style. So I think this is fascinating. Now, you're the government guy, so I'll let you go into some of this.
I'm not the government guy.
Yeah,
but I spent quite a bit of time in the
guy.
industry and
Yeah.
interacting with government, unfortunately.
We love the government. We love it.
Remember you on tape.
That's right.
So, yeah, of course, early drug regulation, there are a lot of milestones with respect to regulations, and this is where you see a lot of the pain. Not so much here, but it's a physicians started pharmacopoeia in 1820. Of course, they started a program of custom inspection of drug imports. In 1902, Biological Control Act, where the Public Health Service authorized the licensed biological drug labs and products. In the 20th century, where, of course, the patent medicines are medicines that had trademarked or patent that you really didn't necessarily know what was in them, were made available and sold across the country.
And this is where the snake oil concept
Yeah,
came
the
from.
snake oil, yep.
Yeah, there's really a product called snake oil.
Yes. And so here's one of them. One of the medicines called Peruna. Half a pint of 90% proof spirits, 1.5 pints of water in a flavor cube, and some burnt sugar for color. And I used to say that these things were marketed and advertised for anything that ails you. And of course, it wasn't that the drug was working, it's just that people didn't care whether or not. They had this either.
Yeah, I think that ad says, cure all ills for man and beast. So if it didn't work for you, you give it to your dog. It's crazy. That Hamlin's, by the way, is a really interesting historical point. That Hamlin was actually, he was a magician, like a traveling magician that did like fairs, little country fairs and whatnot. And he kind of figured out that he would make more money selling drugs at these places than doing his show, doing his act or telling jokes. So he actually ended up going into the drug business from this.
Okay, drug dealer. I'll tell you an interesting story about that. When I started in the pharmaceutical industry, my son went to his elementary school and told him, they asked him what his dad did, and he said, he sells drugs. And of course, I had to go to the school and give a lecture on drug development. But we'll talk about Dr. Harvey Wiley. He was actually in the Department of Agriculture, but he was really what was the first commissioner of what we now call the FDA. He was the one that pushed the issue of requiring purity with respect to drugs, things that were approved as drugs and used in the country. So he was also the first to develop a good housekeeping seal of approval. And so other things, Pure Food and Drug Act, this became Wiley's Act. It was passed in 1906. And I would say it's 240 to 17 in Congress. And every time I look at that, I want to know who those 17 people were and what they were thinking.
This is bipartisan legislation, so it can't happen.
But then you had to give a list of agreements. There weren't any restrictions on the types or amount of ingredients, and no safety or efficacy requirements for those drugs. And as you know, Michael points out that it was passed in 1906, but false claims didn't become a crime until 1911. And I want to know why. What happened?
A little while to enforce that law.
So now, with respect to protecting patients' rights, one of the things that interesting is that the very first effort to document protection of patient rights was in 1931 in response to abuses during trials of pediatric vaccines that were done by the Rights Council in Germany. And of course, they passed a legislation to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects. And this legislation, of course, included guidelines for what we call informed consent. I don't know the details, but I question whether the degree to which people were informed at that time.
Yeah. It probably was a good start, but to your
Yeah.
point, it probably is nothing compared to what we do now. Does anybody know what that is a picture of?
Germany.
Genius. I told you, James, I tell you we have a bunch of geniuses. Anybody want to get more specific? Anybody?
It's a castle.
Castle. Your powers of observation. That's amazing. Does it look like any castle you've ever seen in the middle of the state of Florida? Aha.
Cinderella's
Cinderella's castle. Yes, there you go. I think we can give them credit for that. What are you saying?
So you put
That's
Cinderella's.
yeah,
Okay,
good.
interesting. Okay.
It's called the Neuschwanstein Castle,
Ah,
and that's the castle that the Disney Castle is based on.
ah.
So that's a beautiful, picturesque castle in a picturesque mountain in Bavaria, Germany. Neuschwanstein's the name of the town. But not everything in Germany is so picturesque. So, of course, we had the Nazi hypothermia experiments, and those were experiments. We talked about prisoners, and one person's prisoners is somebody else's heroes.
Mhm.
So when U.S. and Allied airmen were shot down in German waters, they were captured, and then they were brought to these medical detention areas where they did these horrible experiments on them. And they would take the airmen and they put them in freezing cold conditions to see how long it took them to be frozen to death. And once they were frozen to death, they tried to resuscitate them. And they did these horrible experiments, obviously without consent, to see what was necessary to resuscitate Germans that also might have been shot down under those circumstances. So again, these are not, the political Nazis. These were physicians doing these experiments. Completely unethical, but because of intellectual curiosity and I guess loyalty to their country, they felt justified in doing these horrible things. And again, getting into the concepts of one person's prisoners as somebody else's heroes. And of course, you heard about the horrible things that happened at the concentration camps and the death camps, studies with twins and all just absolutely horrific things. So when this came to light after World War II, there was something called the Nuremberg Commission, and based on the Nuremberg Commission, we created the Nuremberg Code of Ethics. And this was the first written code of ethics to define what medical research should look like and what rules medical researchers should follow. But before we get to that, there was some very important things that happened in the US. And this was surrounding another part of your pain hypothesis. So before there's gain, there's pain. And the pain in this case was the sulfanilamide elixir scandal. So sulfanilamide was an early antibiotic. And in order to make it soluble, they had to put it in something. And some genius came up with the idea of putting it in antifreeze, diethylene glycol. So there are bottles of that, and that's actually a picture from the FDA Museum that I took some years ago of the actual product. And it was an antibiotic that was dissolved in antifreeze and distributed around the country. And there are 240 gallons of this raspberry flavored elixir. Kids were getting it. And there were 207 deaths attributable to this product in 15 states. And based on this, the 1938 U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed.
Well, actually, it's 107 people children, mostly children that died in the from the
from the elixir.
elixir. But what a lot of people don't know is there was a 108th victim of that. And that was the chemist that worked for the company that made the drug. And he, in fact, committed suicide because he created something that killed people.
Wow.
He couldn't live with it.
Yeah, we need to update the slide and put it 108. Wow, yeah, that's intense. So this pain resulted in the 1938 U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and this laid out the modern drug regulation process. So in order to get a drug approved, you have to go through a process that pretty much is true nowadays. You have to file an institutional new drug application, or an IND, prior to do any human trials. And then you have a new drug application submission before you can market it based on the data that you collect on the safety and efficacy of your product. And when it was originally passed, the FDA had 60 days to act, and if the FDA didn't say anything within 60 days, then it automatically became approved. And there were 4,000 drugs that got approved under this process based on safety claims alone. But at least now there was a process, and this is part of protecting patients, is we have a process in place so that anything can't just be sold willy-nilly. You have to show that it's safe and hopefully effective, and we'll get into some more details in a second. But prior to that, there was another really, really disturbing study that occurred, and really just tragic is the only word for it, which was started by the U.S. Public Health Service. And back in the early 30s, there was no cure for syphilis. And the thought process is that, well, maybe we need to understand the natural progression of syphilis better. So the idea was put out that we should identify a group of uneducated black men who are sharecroppers in Tuskegee, Alabama, and get them in an observational study where we see what happens when you don't treat syphilis. Well, okay, that's okay if there's no treatment for it, but ethics would dictate that once you have a treatment for it, you need to get the people in the trial involved in that. But that didn't happen. So again, originally a 6-month study, but it kept on going. Well, what happens with neurosyphilis? It kept on going, it kept on going, it kept on going. It went on for nearly 40 years. But even worse than that, this is what I really upsets me, is that when these brave people were volunteering for the Army or got inducted into the Army, there were people from the U.S. Public Health Service that said that, no, you can't give these people penicillin because they're in a study. So the U.S. Public Health Service actually followed the patients to prevent them from being treated with antibiotics.
There are a couple other things associated with it, is that the patients, what's my point?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So just believe it or not, when you look at this, the CDC looked at this in 1969, and in 1969 they said, well, just keep on going. It's been so long anyhow. We just keep on going.
Yeah, but that was part of my point.
Yeah.
It was talked about quite a bit in the medical literature and actually in medical settings about what was going on in Tuskegee. So people knew it was happening all the time. And it took a person, a lay person, a reporter from the Associated Press, who learned about it and said, this is wrong. And then that's when everybody jumped on board to say that, that had to be stopped.
And part of that is this arrogance, is that the learned people we can sit back and learn from the less fortunate people or the unsophisticated people. And that had to change, and it did change.
Okay, let's talk about the Cassandra-Harris Amendment in thalidomide. Now, this was a drug that was first launched in Germany in 1957, called a wonder drug, treat insomnia, headaches, nausea. It was over the counter in Germany in 1960. In fact, it was used quite frequently in women who were pregnant. And the FDA commissioner, actually not the commissioner, the medical reviewer who actually was looking at that, reviewing the drug when they applied for it to be approved in the U.S., refused to allow it to be approved. She said there was insufficient data and a lot of marketing language that really didn't constitute grounds for it to be approved for the U.S. And in fact, later on, of course, we had a big problem of what's called phocomelia, babies born without limbs in Europe as a result of the use of thalidomide. The fact of the matter is there were about 17 births in the U.S. because the company did, in fact, use the drug to some extent in the U.S. to try to get it to the marketplace in the U.S. But 1,270 physicians We're using it in about 2.5 million pills to 20,000 patients, and 500 of whom were pregnant. So it led to the Kefauver-Harris amendment that you have to prove efficacy. Now, the interesting thing, and this is where I digress a little bit, the interesting thing about that is that it requires 2 studies. In the legislation of Kefauver-Harris, the reason it requires 2 studies is because somebody put the S at the end of the word clinical trial in the regulation.
Oh, sorry.
That's the reason somebody put an S. There must be 2 trials, so that's why it requires 2 trials of efficacy, safety, and efficacy. Now, one point that, since I was asked to talk about this, it created a problem when they proved the requirement for efficacy. It created a problem that we had drugs that were around for 100 years where that had been on the market that had never been proven effective. So one of my claims to fame within my company was that I was asked to review one of these products. And because the company that I worked for had, in fact, bought a company that had a product. And the manager of that product didn't believe it worked. I looked at the data and thought it did. So my company, in his wisdom, asked me to talk about the product and defend the product at FDA. So I spent quite a bit of time reviewing the data, and I went to FDA at the FDA Advisory Committee, and in front of the senior managers of the company, in front of my colleagues, in front of the FDA Advisory, the press, the competitors, I spent 2 hours talking about shit. Okay? This was Pepto-Bismol, okay, the pink stuff. They thought it was basically a drug that was just actually just the marketing ploy of pink stuff. But the fact of the matter, the data said the product worked. And there were quite a number of products that fit into that category as a result of that law being passed. You had to do something about all these products that were improving. You had to go back and see which ones were truly effective. And a lot of them went away. But Pepto-Bismol, they
Survived.
survived.
So next time you take Pepto-Bismol, Dr. Powell.
Yeah,
Thank Dr. Powell.
I spent 2 hours talking about unformed shit, watery shit, in front of all of these people, in the press. So anyway, that's just a side issue. But the growth of regulation, again, you see the transition from 1883 to modern day. You see also that the transition that FDA has gone through, and certainly the budget has gone through, 5 million back in 1953 to 5.9 billion now. And one thing that I also mentioned in relation to that is that in modern times, around the 90s, there was what's called negotiated between the FDA and the industry, what's called Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which requires the industry to pay for their review of their product, so that the FDA had enough personnel to be able to review that product. The fact of the matter, a lot of drugs were called in delayed approval just because they didn't have enough people to review it. But the industry started paying. It doesn't pay for an approval. That's the important point. It pays for the review. So even if the review comes out as negative and says the product doesn't work and it shouldn't be marketed, you still got to pay.
And those user fees are now about 40% of the FDA budget, so it's a really significant part.
Yeah, that just gives a breakdown of the budget of the FDA.
Right.
The last slide.
So let's get the audience back involved here. So let's ask you a question here again. We threw out a lot of information about government, and that was a great segment. But let's just now talk about informed consent and get more into the consent elements of things. So obtaining informed consent is 1, an investigator obligation based on 21 CFR Part 50. 2, a patient obligation based on Helsinki Agreement. 3, an IRB obligation based on Nuremberg Code. 4, a sponsor obligation based on the Roche Affair. Or 5, a coordinator responsibility based on Form 1572. So do we have any takers? Obtaining informed consent, what is this, ma'am?
Number 1.
Number 1. Any other opinions? All right, who thinks it's number 1? Who thinks it's number 2? 3, 4, or 5? See, I told you, geniuses. So that is correct. Who knows what 21 CFR means? Anybody? Should I pick on somebody? The distinguished gentleman in the tan suit.
No, I don't know.
The guy next to you, he looks like a doctor.
It's when you have to obtain informed consent.
Brilliant.
That is the best wrong answer I've ever heard. Yeah, CFR is the Code of Federal Regulation. And we talk about it all the time, but people outside the research world would never know. And 21 is one of the chapters. And the chapter 21 that Dr. Powell knows intimately is food and drugs. So when we talk about stuff in research, the two chapters that we get pushed under, and I'm choosing that word carefully, is 21 CFR, which is food and drug, and 45 CFR, which is public welfare. So those are the two areas that affect people that run clinical trials. And part of what we do is, as principal investigators, is to sign off on Form 1572, which documents our commitments and obligations as clinical investigators. And it's going to be hard for you to read that, but basically you agree to tell your patients that they're involved in research, that this is not practice, this is separate from your experience with them as practicing physicians, that you're going to get informed consent on the patients before you do anything, and importantly, that there's an IRB or ethics committee involved. So we talked a little bit about the Nuremberg Code, and it was actually a trial where 23 Nazi physicians were convicted, some of them convicted to death, a lot of them convicted for prison terms. And as important as anything is that at the end of this trial, there was a code of ethics that was promulgated that was the first formal code and adopted by the UN in 1948. And again, it's not as sophisticated as our current ethical obligations, but it had some key things. One is that consent had to be voluntary. You could not force somebody to do a trial. That, interestingly, you could have no a priori expectation of death or disability unless the study doctor also participated in the study, which is
How many of you volunteered for that?
Right. I was going to say, so you could say, well, I think that this can probably kill you, but I took it myself. That was basically what that rule says. You needed to have scientifically qualified investigators conduct the research, that people had the freedom to withdraw. This concept of autonomy was the key part in Nuremberg, that you're free to withdraw. And that there was an obligation of the investigator to terminate the trial as soon as he or she determined that there was a safety risk. So those are the basic principles. But despite that, there was still need for more regulations. So go ahead, James.
So there's, again, more of the pain that we felt to get to the regulations that we have now. And one of them being the Jewish conduct of a program at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in 1963, where 22 chronically ill patients were not consented and injected with live cancer cells, and to assess their immune response. And one of the things I think was really quite egregious was the Willowbrook Hospital study, where mentally retarded children. Like the man, the doctor who did this was a pediatrician. He got parental consent, which is interesting, but he fed feces infected with hepatitis to the kids, largely because they were going to get hepatitis anyway. And he actually stirred the feces up in chocolate milk to give them to the kids. And he was looking at assessing the natural history of disease. And to his death in 1995, Dr. Krugman never thought he did anything wrong.
Wow.
Okay, so now we talk about the Declaration of Helsinki. And you'll see this in just about every protocol discussion of the Declaration of Helsinki. And in 1964, in response to the thalidomide experience, the World Medical Assembly, I believe, which was a predecessor to the World Health Organization, issued 12 principles for the ethical conduct of human research. And there was a publication by Henry K. Beecher on the integrity of the research. It's a foundation of ethical trials.
So who is a picture on this slide? Does anybody want to guess who that could be? I'll give you a hint. His name is on the slide.
Who's going to be brave?
Wow.
All right.
Geniuses, did I tell you? Anyway, yeah, so there's a couple interesting things. Dr. Beecher was an anesthesiologist who practiced at Mass General Hospital for a while. And he had a change of heart during his career. Earlier in his career, he was actually working with the CIA looking at hallucinogens and other ways of mind-bending type of drugs, LSD being one of those drugs. And the CIA was interested in these things to see if they could get confessions out of prisoners and also see if they can create super soldiers that would be less afraid of going into combat, all this kind of crazy stuff. And he was always very quiet about it as he became an academic physician, but always troubled by it. So he ultimately determined that the best protection for people is the integrity of the researcher. And he's well known for that as a very important early medical ethicist. And then getting into some of the Helsinki principles, and there are now 12 important principles. I'm just going to point out a couple. One is that protocols should be reviewed by an independent committee. So the concept of an IRB, or an ethics committee, that is distinct from the clinical investigator came out of the Declaration of Helsinki. And obviously, that is a centerpiece of what we do nowadays. Informed consent, preferably in writing, must be obtained. So now this is not just optional suggestion. It absolutely must be maintained. And there was also some interesting things about an independent physician should be participating if there is a dependent relationship between a patient and an investigator. So some of these ethical tensions that are important and things that we discuss about all the time were now captured and formally discussed. And for those of us that do clinical trials, if you look at any protocol, you will see a reference to the Declaration of Helsinki as the ethical underpinning for doing that particular research project. So an IRB, just I think most people know that, but just to state it, it's an institutional review board. It's defined in 21 CFR Part 56.102. Any board, committee, or other group formally designated by an institution to review, to approve the initiation of, and to conduct periodic review of biomedical research involving human subjects. The primary purpose of such review is to assure the protection of the rights and welfare of human subjects. Huge part of patient protections. Thing that you might be less familiar with is the Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is a group that oversees and monitors clinical trials to ensure participant safety, validity, and the integrity of data. And this group should ideally be independent of the sponsor of the study, just looking at it purely from a scientific point of view. Typically, the DSMB convenes at predetermined intervals, which is often listed in the protocol, depending on the type of study, to review unblinded results. The other part of this is that most people that are operating in a clinical trial setting and environment are in a placebo-controlled environment, and we don't know who's getting the active drug and who's getting placebo. But the DSMB has the data that breaks that down so that they can look at differences in safety and efficacy between treated patients and placebo patients. And the DSMB might recommend study termination either because they're seeing a trend towards lack of safety in treated patients compared to placebo, or they're seeing outrageous benefit of the intervention that everybody should know about, or they realize that this study can go on forever and you're never going to prove anything. It's called futility. So for any of those three reasons, they can stop a study.
I'm going to speak just a second about clinicaltrials.gov. Probably most of you heard of it, but it's available to anyone who wants to go online and find it and look at the database for all the protocols that are currently being conducted in the United States. It's published by the U.S. National Library of Medicine, and basically industry, when they have a protocol that they want to do a trial in the country, they put their protocol in that database for patients and anyone else to see. And you can know who the investigators are and know a little bit about what the trial is all about. And in the 1970s, the National Research Act established the need for local IRBs, and the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was enacted. And one of the things that came out of that is what's called the Belmont Report. That commission issued its report. It was based on Declaration of Helsinki, and of course it emphasized the distinction between research and the practice of medicine. Now, the Belmont Report, the reason it's called the Belmont Report, people ask that question sometimes, because they had the meeting in the Belmont Hotel in New York. That's why it was a Belmont Report. But it really established the ethical underpinning for human research in this country. One being autonomy, or the right of persons to make the decisions for themselves, except for in the case of their protected persons. Beneficence would mean that the benefit in the research had to outweigh the risk, and the justice, meaning that the burden of research should not be to just one part of the population, it to be all people that would receive value from the research. And
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that the original definition was autonomy. And if you can see the little icon in the corner, that changed to respect for persons about 20 years ago. And there's a little difference between autonomy and respect for persons. And autonomy is a little trickier because there are situations where people are not autonomous.
yeah, and in fact, there's some cultures where people depend on others to make decisions for them,
Exactly.
and you have to deal with all those kinds of issues.
Yeah, so interesting ethical balance. But the Belmont Report is a U.S.-based report that sets the ethical underpinning for doing research in the U.S. And it's a huge breakthrough. In my opinion, is that separating line, the MLK separating line. Once we got through 1979, the Belmont Report, we had a clear picture of what ethical research should look like. In my opinion. Not to say that we didn't make mistakes.
Now, one last point is that it did require the first requirement for written informed consent. You can't just say somebody gave you a consent, you have to have it written down. And you have to give the information to people in a language that they can understand to have them say that they're informed. And this is another one of the pain points that we see. And this was a study that's conducted, we'll call it a study, conducted at Johns Hopkins, where one of the scientists there that actually did an experiment with one of the technicians at Johns Hopkins, led to the death of that person, as asthma volunteer. And yeah, so she's 24 years old, medical student. She died in the first week of the study, and matter of fact, it led to I think probably closing down the Johns Hopkins research capability for a while. And one point that I also make is that not everybody's immune. We think we have these large institutions that are pretty powerful. Not everybody's immune to making mistakes and issues with respect to ethics and conduct of research.
And then more recently, the government has put a couple other things in place to make sure that clinical investigators are properly trained. So two of these important moments were in October 2000, the NIH required education and protection of human research subjects for all investigators participating in NIH trials. And then the FDA white paper of 2010 was guiding sponsors. It's not actually a regulation, but it's guidance. But I think industry treats guidance as if it were a regulation. And it guided sponsors to assure GCP trained investigators. So again, it's a bit of a gain and pain point. So often investigators have to sit down and listen to a GCP spiel, even if we know this, like we know our kids. But having said that, I think it's a good practice overall to make sure that all investigators are trained in GCP. And folks like us who have actually taken CPI exams are, quote, certified principal investigators.
Did we define GCP?
Good clinical
Good,
practices.
I know, but I don't know if we stated it.
Go ahead.
Good clinical practice.
Yeah, and that's different than good clinical practices in your office practice. This is good clinical practices in research. Now, informed consent is such an important part of the overall protection of human subjects that we have to spend a little bit more time on that. And the requirement elements of informed consent are: one, stating that it's research; two, the risks of participating in the study are laid out; the benefits or possible benefits are discussed; that alternative treatments are discussed in the informed consent; that if there is an injury during the research process, who's going to pay for it, how do you get treated for it, who do you go to? That has to be in the consent. The confidentiality provisions, what is confidential and what may be shared, is in informed consent. Contacts for the IRB, for the sponsor, for the investigator is all in the informed consent. And finally, pointing out that it's voluntary, that if you need to and want to, you can withdraw from the study.
Now, I mentioned a bit ago about vulnerable subjects, and here we identified, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you see people that are really identified as vulnerable subjects. And I want to make a specific point about, say, the last point there. There can be real or perceived coercion to participate in research that makes people vulnerable. For instance, an employee, you can write anything you want, but if you're employed by someone else, there may be a perception that there's a pressure to participate in research, and that's why those people might be considered vulnerable.
So I guess I'll have to get rid of our requirement for all of our employees to do research.
Yeah, you do.
All right, well, I know there's a reason for this lecture.
So one of the things about obtaining informed consent, one of the important point that I really like to make here is that it is informed decision making. It is a process. It's not an event. It doesn't just stop. And we talk about the fact that people can withdraw anytime they want, but the process goes on throughout the research period. And that, and the other important point is you really can't start anything related to stuff and to the study until you in fact get a written informed consent from that patient. No procedures, no blood draws, anything that might perceive as potential risk associated with the study. Okay, now, yeah, are there any situations, Dr. Corin, where informed consent is not
Funny you should
necessary?
ask. So we're going to end our session today with a little case study. And we're going to use we've now established you're all geniuses. And we're going to use your genius to help us answer important questions. So here's the case study for everybody to think about. So you are all medical ethics and clinical research experts. You open your email to find 5 new consulting gigs awaiting your input. In each case, the question involves whether or not the research subject needs to provide consent. Which, if any, of these projects can continue without the consent of the individual involved in the research? Okay? So do you need the consent of the individual involved in the research? So number 1, on a 6-year-old boy in an asthma study. Number 2, on a lieutenant in the Marines with President of the United States consent. 3, on a patient in a psych unit with legal guardian, when a legal guardian gives permission. On a nameless acute trauma victim, she cannot communicate, but the hospital IRB approved the study. Or on a basketball star or other celebrity whose Hollywood-based doctors perform minimal risk research using practice medical records. So which one of these, if any, do you think you can go without, you can move forward on without the consent of the person who's participating in the study? Can you pass the mic around? Which one do you think?
Number 4,
Number 4. And why do you say that?
can't communicate.
Okay, well, straightforward. Other thoughts?
I think if there are any, it would be number 3.
Number 3. Why is that?
They may not be able to give consent in their right mind, but their guardian may be able to give consent.
Okay. Any other? That wasn't a like right brain, left brain thing. Go ahead. Anybody else?
In my opinion, I might be wrong, but if this is a research intervention, then none of these cases would be appropriate for emergency use if it's research. So I would say none of them.
Okay. Do you have any other opinions?
I think it might depend on what data you're collecting. So if it's a records review versus actually doing a procedure, then it could be allowed.
Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting. These are the type of things we actually discuss all the time. When do you need consent? What types of consents? What are the considerations? But the answer is that no patient consent is necessary in any of these situations. And there's reasons for it. So before I go there, let me just make sure we understand what we're talking about. Some of this is wordplay and understand the exact definition of things. So consent actually means the legal effective agreement of the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative based on information that is given to the subject or the representative in understandable language. That's the formal definition of consent. Assent is a child's affirmative agreement to participate in research. And permission is the agreement of a participant, parent, or guardian to the participation of the child or ward in research. It's usually for kids. Like, for example, if you have a divorced family and the mom is giving consent, you get permission from the dad. It's not a formal consent, but it's permission. Or in a case where there may be minimal risk research where you don't have to necessarily get formal informed consent, but you ask for permission. So in each of these cases, the actual person that's involved either doesn't have the right to give consent or is incapable of it. So for the child, a 6-year-old child is not legally capable of giving consent. Can only give assent, and at 6 years old, they may be too young to give assent. If they're 12, you get assent, but at 6, you probably wouldn't. In the case of a soldier, actually, when you sign up for the military, you surrender that right to the president. So the president of the United States can actually sign consent for a soldier, which is an interesting little tidbit. For somebody in a psych unit, as mentioned, the discussion of research can put you in a bad place. So there's sometimes situations where you can't even bring it up to somebody, and you have to rely on the guardian to actually do the consenting work. In the case of the person who is a trauma victim, as mentioned, they can't communicate. So in that case, either you find somebody who can act as a guardian, although usually in trauma, you wouldn't anticipate it, you wouldn't even know who it is. Or you have an IRB that intervenes and says, yes, in this situation, you can go ahead and do what you need to do. And then finally, if there's something called minimal risk research, you don't even have to tell the patients about it at all. So when a physician's office wants to do a chart review for research purposes, they still need a protocol, they still need to have a structured element, but as long as it's de-identified and they're not getting to specific things, then they can do it without the patient level consent.
But they still have to get IRB permission to say that it is truly a minimal risk.
Yeah, to be safe. Now, the practices have a little bit more leeway than outside researchers, but you're absolutely right. Is that if Johns Hopkins wanted to look at records here in Jacksonville, they'd have to get IRB approval, a protocol, et cetera, et cetera. If an internal practice wanted to do just a little bit of a chart review, there's a little bit different rules. But anyhow, in this case, again, because of the specific definition of consent, none of those people really needed to be consented. So kind of interesting. So that's our session for today. We have 2 minutes for any questions. Any questions about anything that came up? No? Just do you feel smarter? Okay. Well, thank you so much, James. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. I enjoyed it. I hope we were able to convey some important information to you about this super important topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.